And welcome back to All Day Live. It's 12:30. We're really glad that you're with us. If you are a parent of kids who are school-aged, K through 12, you may have noticed a pretty big change in their attendance policies at school. Last spring, our state legislature here in Minnesota unanimously passed a bipartisan bill aiming to crack down on chronic absence. What is that? Well, it's defined by 10% of school days missed, excused or unexcused, throughout a school year. So if your school year is 180 days, 18 days missed across that year is going to trigger some things. We'll talk about that in a second. Now, according to the Star Tribune, there was an article they wrote a couple of years ago. The state's largest school district, Hennepin, says that in 2023, 1 in 4 students was chronically absent, which is nearly double the rate from pre-pandemic years, according to their calculations. Now, one of the laws that did change here in Minnesota, and we'll break down a couple of them here, but one is all absence requests now have to go through one person who is designated at your child's school. So a designated truant officer, it could be the principal at your school, but it is now filtered through one person so that they can keep very detailed track of it. Also, if a student misses 15 consecutive days in a row, unexcused absences, they're going to be unenrolled. And then the superintendent and the county services have to get involved, and they will create a plan for return. There's a lot here. It's 15 consecutive days in a row at any point in the school year that's going to trigger that unenrollment, and then also the 18 days across the school year, so sporadically, and that is even if you take your child out for a doctor's appointment and they miss an hour, it's going to accumulate those hours as well. So it's not just one full day. I know I'm getting into the weeds here, but I think it's really important for parents to try to understand. And if you have questions, email me right now, actually allday@fox.com, because we have an expert who's going to help us sort through some of what's happening on the bigger picture, and then also I have more information on Minnesota specifically. So Nat Malkus, Senior Fellow, Deputy Director of Education Policy at the American Enterprise Institute. And one of your areas of expertise is really education in the wake of the pandemic, which so many of us have so many questions. Nat, thank you for being here.
Glad to be here.
So generally speaking, I guess your research gets really in depth, and it is a great resource. But generally speaking, how bad is this problem of chronic absenteeism?
Well, chronic absenteeism is a problem. It's, as you said, when students miss 10% of the school year, and it's linked to bad outcomes for students. They get worse scores on achievement tests, they're much less likely to graduate. And this was a problem before the pandemic, when about 15% of students nationwide, that's K to 12, were missing at least 10% of the school year. Then the pandemic hit, and that number surged to 28.5%. That's about a 90% increase.
Wow.
Since then, it's been falling, but not nearly fast enough.
Okay, so do you think some of this is, or does your research show that some of this is just is a mindset thing, where maybe students and parents are just a little bit more like, well, I'm used to this now, and is it some of it just attitude towards absence in school?
Well, I study nationwide trends, so it's kind of hard to know exactly what's going on in people's heads. But look, we had a normal sort of, again, not a great rate of 15% before the pandemic, but it was stable. And then in the pandemic, we had this huge shift. So what might have gone on there? Well, I think there was a lot of strong messages during the pandemic. You need to keep your student home from school with powerful messages behind them.
Yeah.
Someone might get sick. A grandparent might die. These are very powerful messages. And then when we returned kids to school, the messages were kind of like, school's open again. Not quite as powerful. And so you can see how the first messages would change behavior. And now we need equally powerful messages to change behavior when millions of students, at least 4 million students more this year than before the pandemic, are missing 1/10 of the year.
Yeah, it's tricky, because as a parent who actually had one of my kiddos who had long haul COVID symptoms, and so there are real there are some real tangible physical things that can keep kids home. And so what is your advice or recommendation for people? I mean, do they have to get a doctor's note every single time? Or if I've got a kid who just because of these symptoms just isn't able to get out of bed, that morning or whatever, it gets very muddy in the details here, especially coming out of COVID and all that we don't know yet.
Yeah, there's a number of things to say there. I mean, look, nobody is advocating to send kids to school sick. We don't want other kids to get sick, and when kids are sick, they should stay home. At the same time, we have seen a shift in sort of attitudes and behavior about, well, what constitutes a reason to stay home from school if you're sick. So I think that often what we're seeing is parents who are now much more sensitive to these things, and what they might have just thought was, mild symptoms that don't require keeping students home. We probably have a lot more parents keeping students home. We do have folks at school to help with this. We have school nurses that can be on the front lines to just sort of right size, when is it time to keep your kid home? If they're sick, keep them home, but too often we're keeping them home when we don't need to.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about the why, because clearly, obviously here in Minnesota, we had, a lawmaker, Representative Keeler, who stepped up and said, this is something that we need to focus on, had bipartisan support and really tightened up restrictions around this. You talk about, I use the 18 days as an example, and that's if you had 180 days, right, in your school year. That's just an easy way to say 10%. But as a parent, in the last couple of years, especially, if I think about 18 days across the course of those 8-9 months of school, it doesn't feel like a whole lot. Talk about some of the ramifications of missing 10% of your school year.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things to understand here, and I do a lot of this research and we do the stats and so forth, but one thing to notice is that it's not just chronic absenteeism. Absences are up sort of across the board since the pandemic. And we also know that every day counts. You don't have to get to 18 days absence for absences to take a toll on test scores, take a toll on how much you're learning, how connected you are. So 18 days may not seem like a lot, but if you had 18 absences from work, I think a lot of folks that are working full-time jobs would realize that that's a lot. In school, we ask you to be there 180 days. School is important, it's good, and we want students to be there consistently so that they can get the most out of it. Really consistent attendance, it pays off in the long run, both in terms of test scores, but also in terms of the sort of soft skills that we want kids to develop, so when they hit college or the workforce, that they know they got to keep their shoulder to the things that they are focused on and keep at it. So I think there's a lot of reasons for us to all take more seriously consistent attendance. Yeah.
Was there anything in your research that surprised you, or anything that was sort of notable that you feel like you'd want to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, at the Return to Learn Tracker, we have gathered the data across all 50 states, thousands of districts. And look, oftentimes when we see something that's going wrong in our education system, we see it in a particular place or for a particular group of students, and it's sort of localized. What we saw with the attendance patterns was we saw proportional increases everywhere. It's not that disadvantaged students don't have higher rates of absenteeism. They do, but during the pandemic, everybody's absenteeism went up 80 to 90%. And so what we really saw during the pandemic was something that affected all corners of society, all kinds of kids, all grades saw this increase. And so one of the most surprising things was to see this rising tide that really increased absences for everyone. And I think that also tells us something about what we're up against here. Yeah. And that is that it's sort of changing expectations, changing ideas of what's normal, and that's a tough thing to combat. And that's why, as you said, this isn't a partisan issue, and it's not just something for teachers to worry about or parents. It really is something that we need to have all hands on deck to combat. Wow.
All right, thank you, Nat, for your research. It's really, really interesting. If folks want to check out more, where can they find your work?
Well, we keep updating the data at returntolearntracker.net, where you can see historic rates of absenteeism and lots of aspects of schools post-pandemic outcomes on our website, and then you can find my writing at aei.org.
Yeah, it really is laid out very, it's very user-friendly for folks if you want to check out more. So Nat, thank you for your time today and sharing some of your insights from your research. We really appreciate it.